so we took turns reading it. Before you know what kindness really is, writes poet Naomi Nye, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. It was that poem, more than anything else, certainly more than anything I said, that opened a window that afternoon, let a little bit of light in, and allowed the three of us to move forward in planning a sad and difficult funeral. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. Sometimes there are these words in the world that read us every bit as much as we read them. You must wake up with sorrow, says the poet. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. It's this experience of losing things, of feeling the future dissolve in a moment, that Jeremiah is addressing in this morning's text from the Hebrew Scripture. Whether or not you've lost a son, and I know some of you in the room have, there are so many ways in which you and I know what it's like for the future to dissolve in a moment. There are so many ways in which we get tossed around and flung far into exile, losing touch with our core, our center, our soul, fearing a future we can't see or trust anymore. As I went around this week to different study groups with this text from Jeremiah, I was reminded by many of you of all the other ways we experience exile and loss. You talked about losing a partner or a spouse after decades of life together and love, the loneliness and isolation of widowhood. You talked about spiraling into depression and despair, living for days on end in the soul's dark night, all the ways we lose touch with our soul, with our core, our center. You talked about losing a job you really loved, the spiritual angst and dislocation that comes with financial uncertainty. You talked about giving birth to a child with special needs, autism, Down syndrome, and the loss of other dreams, other visions along the way. All these ways we get tossed around and flung far into exile, and almost every time it feels like the future's dissolving. Maybe in a flash, maybe for some of us frame by frame by frame, but it feels as if the center just can't hold and the relationships we counted on just can't survive the unraveling of time. And that's what's going on. That's what's going on for Jeremiah's colleagues, friends, neighbors. Exile. A devastating national disaster, in this case, in the 6th century BCE, a dismantling of their beloved city, Jerusalem, forcing most of them to abandon homes and neighborhoods and relocate to Babylon, hostile territory. Not only has the future dissolved, but all the gardens they cultivated, all the temples they loved, all the traditions they protected, they've lost everything, devastated and dismantled, and they wake up in Babylon. So what do you say if you're Jeremiah? How do you encourage a community in exile? Jeremiah searches for meaningful words, honest words, authentic words, but it's not so simple to be a prophet. And there are other prophets, frankly. There are these other prophets among the exiles, somewhat gleefully predicting powerful Babylon's demise. These other prophets don't want the exiles to worry too much, to spend time changing their ways or adjusting to local customs. Don't worry, be happy, they announce. That's sort of their spiel. Don't worry, be happy. Easier times are coming. Babylon's falling soon. You'll all be going home. Things will be just like they used to be. But Jeremiah's not buying what those other prophets are selling. God, he insists that the broken-hearted exiles prepare for a long stay, an extended journey in the foreign land. Build new houses in Babylon, he says. Plant new gardens And most importantly, radically, seek the welfare of the city where God has sent you into exile and pray to God for its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your own. Imagine that. Imagine Jeremiah proposing that Jews in exile seek the welfare of Babylonian neighbors and villages. Imagine him daring these broken-hearted Jews, cut off from homeland and heartland, daring them to pray to God on behalf of the very culture that ripped their hearts from the land they love. This may be one of the most provocative prophetic texts we have in the Bible. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you, says God through this nervy prophet, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, in the welfare of Babylon, you will find your own. So words matter. At least Jeremiah stakes his vocation on that belief, that words matter. There's a contest going on between two very different schools of prophetic thought, and Jeremiah weighs in with new words. He makes his case with provocative, unexpected words. Settle in, he insists. Settle in and do all the things that make for life and longevity and healing and wholeness. Build homes, plant orchards, fall in love, raise families, and pray for your neighbors. Look out and pray for all your neighbors in Babylon. Well, fast forward with me from that time and place to our own, 26 centuries later, because I'm reminded this morning of our collective experience, our national experience in the weeks just after September 11th, 2001. Against our will, that terrible day, we were sent reeling into some awful kind of exile. Those first few days and weeks were like one long, extended nightmare, a living nightmare, where our center no longer held. And relationships of all kinds stretched and ripped and frayed. It was an exile of sorts, a sudden deportation, a cardiac arrest, a dismantling of the future in an instant. And don't you remember how loud were the so-called prophets who called for vengeance, for swift retribution and punishment? Don't delay, they urged. Don't think too much, they cautioned. Act fast, be strong, prove decisive. We'd been humiliated, and we'd have to show the enemy who was boss, who was to be feared. And you know the story. How we rushed as a nation into two terrible and unwinnable wars. How we missed out on all kinds of opportunities for reflection and for self-correction and for bridge building. I know, and you know too, that there were voices like Jeremiah's speaking up in those first days after 9/11, voices advocating restraint, voices inviting deliberation, reflection, prayer, voices calling for new relationships and new initiatives and a sense of shared destiny among all peoples of all faiths. Pray for peace, they urged us then. Seek the welfare of an international community. Resist the impulse to return terror for terror. For our welfare is their welfare, and we are bound inextricably in a network of mutuality. There were voices like Jeremiah's. And what if we'd taken them to heart? What if we'd spent those billions and billions of dollars and brain cells on making common cause with the Muslim world, on developing educational partnerships, business partnerships, cooperative partnerships? What if we'd spent prayer time and academic time and town hall time investigating the roots of anti-American antagonism, the roots of all this terror? Maybe it was time back then to treat the rest of the world as something other than our own backyard, as something other than George Bush's oil fields. But we didn't do too much listening back then in 2001, not as a people, not as a nation. Jeremiah went pretty much ignored among us. And I guess I'm wondering if we're paying a price for that today.